Another edition of Icebreakers delivered by our friends over at DoorDash. And usually, Chris, it's Frank Saravalli, the insider, who's here to give us all the knowledge, but he's gone. He's on his way to Colorado to cover the Cup final. So we're the insiders today. We get to talk about what we want. But Frank does have his new buyout list up at dailyfaceoff.com 10 candidates who he thinks could be bought out this summer. I want to pick your brain a little bit for some front office thoughts on this. Is a buyout always considered sort of the last resort, and kind of what other routes are kicked around a front office when you're looking at trying to get rid of a contract that you don't like anymore?
Yeah, I mean, there's two different lenses that you have to look at this with. Sometimes there's an ownership lens where they just want to save the money, right? Because a buyout, you can pay the guy 2/3 of the actual cash value if he's over 26, or 1/3 if he's under 26. And sometimes ownership just wants to save that money. And then from a GM lens, if you do the buyout, you're stuck with that dead cap for a player that's no longer on your roster. And so I think from the management perspective, you want to avoid that at all costs if possible. So there's a couple of other options you have. One is, if you can move the player and maybe dangle an asset, prospect, or a pick, wrap that around the guy's neck and send him the other way to a team that's looking to acquire those assets. That might be attractive. And if it's only a buyout for 1 year or even 2 years, another team that's not in the go for it stage might be willing to do that to recoup the asset. So as long as the asset value isn't too significant, if it's a fourth or fifth pick and you can move the guy that way, I think that's always tempting instead of having that dead cap. The other thing is you can put a guy in the AHL and there's a savings to the team of, I think the number is 1.125, and it kind of goes up every year a little bit, but it's the amount that you can bury and not have hit your NHL cap. So in some cases, when you're evaluating the buyout versus burying a guy in the NHL, those numbers after you deduct the savings can be pretty close. And so, in those cases, I think putting the player in the AHL and taking that charge because it only hits in that year, the best option, and you just have to endure that pain in order to maximize your cap space in the particular year, especially when if you're a team that's sort of in the mix and a contender and you just need a little bit more cap space. You're willing to push your problems down the road a little bit to maximize your space in the current year.
So let's take a look at the top five that Frank outlined over at the site. And I want to start with number one here, Zack Kassian. He's got 2 more years left at a $3.2 million AAV. If the Oilers were to buy him out this year, well, that number would drop to just $660K, meaning they would save over $2.5 million this season. They would then save $1.4 million the year after, and then they'd have to endure 2 years of a $960,000 cap penalty, you can call it. I think this is Cassian's number one for a reason. I think this makes a ton of sense for the Edmonton Oilers. You're a team who has 3 pending RFAs and Ryan McLeod, Jesse Puljujarvi, and Kyler Yamamoto. If you want to sign those 3 and bring back Brett Kulak, who was probably their best defenseman in the playoffs, and if Mike Smith goes, you need a new goalie, and you maybe want to look at signing Evander Kane or finding a way to replace his production. Okay, well, I just counted off 6 things you need to do with $7 million, right? Or sorry, about $11 million with Clefbaum on LTIR right now. You might need to sacrifice the overpaid bottom 6 winger, even if you like his intangibles and you like Kassian in the room, you like his physical edge. He scored a couple of big goals in the playoffs. I'm not saying he's a useless player at all, but he's grossly overpaid for a guy who's likely going to sit on your 4th line next season. I think this is kind of a no-brainer for the Oilers if you can't find a team to take his deal.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tyler. And the big if there is if you can't find a team. And you mentioned Kassian still has some utility. So for a team that, again, we talked about it before, for a team that isn't going for it and has the cap space and can take on a $3.2 million cap hit, if you can give them an asset for that, then you save the full 3.2, right? And but the fact that it's only 900 and change, it's basically an entry level contract in the first year, 2 entry level contracts in the second year, and then back to kind of a league minimum third and fourth year. It's not that bad, right? You could look at that and say, hey, that gives us savings in each of the next 2 years, and we'll worry about years 3 and 4 down the road. I still think Kassian has some value and could be traded. But if at the end of the day they can't find a home for him, then yeah, you're right. It's on here for a reason, because the mathematics of it do make sense.
Matt Murray, Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who we might talk about in a second, Scandella, and Jason Dickinson are in the top 5. Is there another name in the top 10, though, who really caught your attention, Chris?
Yes, and it's Philippe Myers. And the reason, so let's just bring up his cap here. There is a $617,000 credit against the cap in that first year. And this is so in real dollars, his buyout is 1.2 million. So a team's going to have to pay 1.2 million of real dollars over those first 2 years. But the cap charge is different, and because of the way his contract was structured, he was paid something like 1.2 million in the first year, 2.5 in the second, and 3.8 is what's scheduled to be paid this year. The league, the cap calculations basically look at it as you already suffered the cap consequence of a higher cap versus his salary in year 1. So now in year 3, you actually get the benefit of a cap that's lower than the salary. So it's a mathematical calculation, but at the end of the day, it results in a cap credit in that first year. So if you're a team that's desperate for cap space, you might want to trade for Philippe Myers and buy him out yourself, and then you get that credit. You still have the charge in year 2, but if this is the year when you really need that savings, then pretty attractive piece to go and acquire.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be really, really interesting. There'd definitely be a contender or two out there who sits there and goes, yeah, the cap charge in 2 years, yeah, we'll deal with that when we get there. We'd love an extra $600K to make some moves right now. Another name quickly before we flip to Vlasic, Patrick Nemeth, number 9 on the list. That was a guy there, when you look at the $2.5 million AAV and the fact you'd only save $1.5 million this year, he feels like one of those candidates, Chris, who just bury him instead of buying him out, right?
I think so, right? You get the 1.125 or whatever that number is, close to 1.2. You get that off your books, and that's going to be almost the same as the cap charge from a buyout. So yep. I think you do the analysis, and if you're a couple of hundred grand either way, I think it makes more sense to bury the player and not have the multiple years of cap charges that a buyout entails.
Just quickly to wrap this up, Marc-Edouard Vlasic, if we could flip back to him, it's definitely the most egregious buyout on this list. I mean, it's 3.7, 1.4, 4.2, 5.2, and then 4 more years of $1.7 million in dead money. I get he's 35 years old. I get he's not the defenseman he used to be. But I mean, even if you just wait 1 more year, grind it out with Vlasic on your third pairing, at least it would cut down the amount of dead money by a couple of seasons if you bought him out next year. That's a stunning buyout, and I just can't see a way in which San Jose does that and then continues to build a team that's competitive.
I couldn't agree more. You get an egregious buyout when you hand out an egregious contract. I think Vlasic was just, and San Jose's done it with a couple of their defensemen where they were too old to be giving an 8-year deal. That's the consequences. You get to a stage where you have to look at this scenario where you either buy them out or you have to live with this huge cap inefficiency. But having a cap charge for 8 years, like that, just to me, that doesn't make any sense. So if you can squeeze a little more juice out of him this year and then have only 6 years, or play him for 2 years and then only have 4 years on the books, like there's got to be a way to minimize that. It's just too long to have to deal with the pain of your mistake. And it's going to be a tough one regardless of how they proceed with him. But 8 years, and it's not just 8 years. A couple of those years is 4.2, 5.2. It's a little bit like the Parisian Suter buyouts in Minnesota that we've talked about ad nauseum that are going to cause such grief for them. You have buyouts this significant, and it's really, really hard to construct your way out of them.
Chris, I view buyouts as going out for drinks with your buddies. In the moment, it's great. You slam 100 beers, you're having a good time, you're living it up. It's the next morning, Chris. It's the next morning that always gets you.
That's a perfect analogy.
That's going to do it for another edition of Icebreakers, delivered by our friends at DoorDash. Promo code DFODD and DFODDUS gets you 25% off and no delivery fees on your first order. Shout out to DoorDash.